The NHL Four Nations face-off rosters have been revealed, and there are some snubs to talk about on today's edition of Locked On Oilers.
You are Locked On Oilers, your daily podcast on the Edmonton Oilers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel, where you can enjoy the NFL season with a big return. New customers can place a $5 bet. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So, on today's show, Oilers got snubbed, Connor McDavid leading Team Canada, and a whole lot of international hockey to break down. So, at the outset, coming into this week, I felt reasonably confident that Mattias Ekholm was going to make Team Sweden. That's not a surprise. He is one of the 6 best defensemen in the world from Sweden. It was just simply a matter of, did they have a specific vision for how they wanted to build the roster? That's definitely a theme when it comes to the United States and Team Canada, which we're definitely going to talk about. But Ekholm on Sweden, perfect sense. Perfect sense. Elite defensive defenseman, quality puck mover who doesn't get enough credit for his puck skills in all fairness, and somebody who's going to be able to play with any of the other defensemen on that team. And it wouldn't really be an issue. You know, they can play Ekholm with Dahlin. If Dahlin wants to play on the right, Ekholm can play with Forsling. He could play with Erik Karlsson. The Swedish team has the benefit, and I talked about this with Hunter Hodes on the Locked On NHL episode we did talking about the Four Nations face-off. Sweden right now is currently benefiting from the wave of young people, the children who grew up watching Nick Lidstrom play hockey. And Nick Lidstrom, one of the great defensemen in the history of the sport, so many Norris trophies, multiple Stanley Cups, one of the most gifted, fluid skaters to ever grace the back end. And that's why you have this wave of defensemen from Sweden, because all those kids grew up watching Nick Lidstrom. That's why you have Erik Karlsson. That's why you have Victor Hedman. That's why you have Rasmus Dahlin. This is an incredibly gifted group on the back end. It is really versatile and really the strength of this team. But this first segment is about the snub. I can't in good conscience say that I'm particularly surprised that Evan Bouchard and Zach Hyman were left off of the Team Canada roster. Coming into this week, earlier in the week when we did Four Nations face-off preview conversation, I said McDavid and Ekholm were locks. I said, I think Hyman probably makes the team, which ultimately didn't come to fruition. And I said, quote, Evan Bouchard is not going to make this team, but he probably should. I don't think there's an argument that Colton Parayko is better than Evan Bouchard in 2024. I don't think that's the reality of the situation. It's just not true. No matter what metrics you want to use, what evaluation process, Colton Parayko is on this team because Team Canada has a very specific vision for how they want to play in this tournament. And it's tied to their goaltending situation. And we're going to talk about that too, because Stuart Skinner was in that conversation over the summer. Of course, now, based on the first few months of this season, the 2024-2025 season, Skinner not really in the mix based on that. But I don't think you're going to be able to convince me that you're not going to be able to convince me that Parayko is better than Evan Bouchard. You're just not. There is nothing you're going to be able to tell me, whether it's counting stats. Look, if you want to do he's got a Stanley Cup ring, he plays the defense better. Sure, I guess, but he doesn't play defense better. And look, I in particular, I have been hard on aspects of Evan Bouchard's defensive game in his own zone, because if he can unlock that final phase, this guy has top 5 defensemen in the entire world potential. I think he's already pretty on the cusp. I think he's right there in that conversation for that second tier of guys with Miro Heiskanen. Okay. If it wasn't going to be Evan Bouchard, it should have been Dougie Hamilton. That's my concession here. If you are listening to this as somebody who wants to see an Oilers fan overreact to Evan Bouchard getting left off, it's not so much that Bouchard himself was left off. It's that they left better players. Canada, Don Sweeney, who was the decision maker here, left better players off the roster to execute a specific vision. And that'll naturally segue us into Zach Hyman, who, look, I know Zach Hyman is not happy with the start he's had. I know he's injured. It's great. He's going to be back in the lineup tonight against Columbus. I'm excited to see him play, to start working back. If there are injuries, if Mark Stone, for whatever reason, happens to be injured in early February again through the trade deadline and gets LTIR'd and Zach Hyman's an injury replacement, wouldn't surprise me in the slightest. But said it on yesterday's show, the episode that aired earlier today, Zach Hyman hasn't gotten going yet. This is somebody who's shooting less than half of his career shooting percentage so far this season. This is somebody who is struggling to really get going. And I think some of it is just bad luck. I think when you look at the shooting percentage and the chance metrics, you get a pretty clear picture that the Oilers haven't gotten the goaltending, that Hyman has shot a little bit fewer times per game than he has in years past as an Oiler. And all of that in conjunction with some bad luck and some bad team luck has put him on the outside looking in. Now, if we had done this exercise, say July, there's an argument Zach Hyman's on the first line. There's an argument Zach Hyman is the first line right wing for Connor McDavid. I think there's a strong argument that Zach Hyman probably deserves to be on this team based on his track record over the last handful of seasons. And I do think it's interesting that certain players like Parayko, their previous experience is what mattered more. Parayko won a championship a couple years ago. Somebody who's played a lot of minutes on a Blues team that isn't particularly good, especially now, is he's being rewarded for his past performance. Evan Bouchard right now is playing better than Colton Parayko. He probably deserves to be on that team over him. But when we get to the forward group and we're talking about Canada for who Zach Hyman should be on the team over. So on the right side, The Athletic has this as the depth chart, but we don't know what centers are going to play center and what centers are going to play wing yet. But you're not going to play Hyman. You're not going to take Hyman over Mitch Marner. Yes. You're not going to take Hyman over Nathan McKinnon. Yes. You're not going to take Hyman over Mark Stone. Yes. Are you going to take Hyman over Travis Konechny? I would. I think Zach Hyman's a better hockey player than Travis Konechny. Now, this is where we're going to get into what we're talking about in the next segment, the idea of building a specialized team as opposed to the best possible team. And Hyman doesn't kill penalties. And we'll talk more about the vision for Canada in the second segment, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself because that's the entirety of the next segment. But when you leave quality players at home, when you leave really gifted players, you run the risk of looking like you're trying to outsmart everyone else. There is such a thing as being too in the weeds, if you will, being so obsessed with, well, we got to play a certain way. We got to have a certain type of player to play that way. And I understand it as a concept, like sitting here on the outside looking in as somebody who wasn't in the room with Don Sweeney picking Team Canada. I can understand what they're trying to do. The thing is, if you build a specialized team with guys for specific roles and it doesn't work, then you look stupid. Then you look like you were trying to be smarter than everybody else as opposed to actually being smarter than everyone else. But we are going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about each team's individual vision for itself coming up right after this. Get ready to tackle NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. Tonight, great game in the NFL. Packers-Lions. The Lions, Super Bowl favorites in the NFC. The Lions are 3.5-point favorites. The best game of the weekend, though. Sunday Night Football. Justin Herbert and the Chargers heading to Arrowhead to take on the two-time defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs, where the Chiefs are 3.5-point favorites. So get in on the action and visit FanDuel.com or download the app. You can get started with $100, $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. It's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Thursday. Yeah, this is going to run on Thursday night edition of Locked On Oilers. We will have an episode for you after the game tonight against the Blue Jackets. Whenever you happen to watch this episode, whether it's Thursday, Friday, or over the weekend, this is intended to be a bonus episode. Because frankly, I wasn't planning on doing this episode for Locked On Oilers. I was going to leave this for some time next week. But frankly, I talked about it with Hunter Hodes on Locked On NHL. And frankly, I was really excited. Frankly, I have been fiending this as a hockey fan, as somebody who genuinely loves the game. There is nothing better than this. Look, the Stanley Cup playoffs are incredible. They're the best playoffs in sports. It's the second best tournament in all of sports after the World Cup. Look, the World Cup scarcity once every 4 years, it makes it really special, and it makes it really feel like a cultural moment in a way that the playoffs can't every year. When we're talking about international hockey, best on best hockey, stupidity has prevented us from having this for the first time in a long time. You know, the last time we had a best on best NHL player eligible tournament where the league let the players go was 2016. It was a World Cup of hockey. It was played before the regular season. You know, it was a preseason tournament, and it was fun. I mean, I have a Team North America Connor McDavid jersey. I'm wearing underneath my sweatshirt a Team USA t-shirt from that tournament. I have a Team USA Max Pacioretty t-shirt in my drawers behind me. But it's been 9 years. It'll be 9 years by the time this Four Nations Face-Off tournament is played next February in Montreal and Boston. Me and my friends are currently debating whether we're going to pony up and go because, frankly, it's very expensive. But at the same time, this is a very, it's a special feeling. You don't get moments like this all of the time. And that brings us to what I wanted to talk about here. Talking about the vision for Team Canada. It is very clear that for the last 15 years or so, we'll say, the singular force in which Hockey Canada has orbited around is Sidney Crosby. When you listen to these interviews of all of these players who've been selected for Team Canada, from the very best in the world, Connor McDavid and Nathan MacKinnon, all the way down to the specialists, like Seth Jarvis, like Travis Konechny, all of these guys are chomping at the bit for a chance to play with Sidney Crosby. And moments like this don't get to happen a whole lot in hockey. There is not nearly the roster fluidity and player mobility, for lack of a better expression, to get to where you want to be. You know, it's really difficult for players to leverage where they want to get because of the way contracts are set up in this league. But Team Canada is effectively an entire generation of guys who have grown up wanting to be Sidney Crosby, chasing their dream, becoming great NHL players. And when you look at this roster, you see a lot of guys who have grown up in a world where all they have known is Sidney Crosby as the face of the NHL. And that includes the next wave of guys. You know, MacKinnon is in between McDavid and Crosby, but MacKinnon didn't really blossom until McDavid was already in the league. So that presents a unique quandary of like, where does that generation start versus stop? Whatever. Canada is assembled with one specific vision. They're going to win with sound, structured, and frankly, gritty hockey. You know, they opted to bring Travis Konechny and Anthony Cirelli over some of the more talented players they could have chosen from, like, say, Nick Suzuki or Mark Scheifele. And in picking the guys they have, and I want to pull up the roster here, down the middle, they have McDavid, Crosby, Point, Cirelli. On the left, Reinhart, Marchand, Brandon Hagel, and Seth Jarvis. And now look, no disrespect to Brandon Hagel, to Seth Jarvis. I think those guys are both pretty good at hockey. I think now, with the benefit of multiple years of hindsight, it's very clear the Tampa Bay Lightning identified something in Brandon Hagel's game they felt they were going to be able to unlock, that they were going to be able to bring out and frankly make him a more well-rounded player. He records a lot of points. He was over 70 points last year as somebody who didn't get a ton of power play one time with Tampa Bay, so that's something that's interesting to me. But the big question I have, and one of the real curiosities, how are we deploying this lineup if we're Canada? And I ask that because the last few times we've done this with the best in the world, Canada's checking or defensive line, whichever phraseology you would like to use, has been Brad Marchand, Sidney Crosby, and Patrice Bergeron. Of course, Patrice Bergeron is retired from professional hockey. I don't hesitate to think that Patrice Bergeron could walk onto the Bruins and be their best center right now after not playing for last season. But with no Bergeron, it lends itself to this. Are we going to use Sid as our fulcrum? Are we going to use him on an offense first line where we're going to tell him your only responsibility is to create chances, to score, to drive offense? Or are we going to use him with some of those more defense-oriented players like Konechny, like Cirelli? You know, Team Canada could have brought in, or I shouldn't say brought in, brought-in's not a word, could have brought more talented players. You know, there are plenty of guys who are more than worthy of being chosen for this spot. These spots, I should say. You know, I'm not terribly hung up that Evan Bouchard didn't get picked over Parayko. But again, that's tied to the vision. And Team Canada's goaltending situation, being that they have probably the weakest goalie room of the four teams in this tournament with Jordan Binnington, Aiden Hill, and Sam Montembaugh. Look, none of those three guys is going to inspire a ton of confidence in you. But Don Sweeney picking those three guys and then these defensemen and these forwards, that tells me he understands they're going to need to play really defensively sound hockey. And look, I don't want to sound like too much of a dork here, but I'm not watching best on best hockey to watch guys dump and chase and cycle the puck. I want to see kinetic energy. I want to see up and down. I want to see action. I want to see chances. I want cross-seam passes. I want one-timers. I want 3-on-2s, 2-on-1s. I want this to look like the best hockey we can play. And I'm not saying the Team Canada's assembled is bad. Of course it's not. They have 2 of the 4 or 5 best players in the entire world. 3 if you want to include Makar. I know Makar, I've been hard on Makar because frankly his defense has kind of tanked, frankly. His offensive production is still great, but he's not providing nearly the amount of defense that he did earlier in his career. And look, if he wants to focus on all offense and be Canadian Erik Karlsson, that's fine. You know, the Avalanche aren't my team. But if we're doing that, why couldn't Bouchard get on this team? You know, if defense is what matters and the golden boy doesn't play defense, we're talking out of the both sides of our mouths here. And look, I'm not particularly hung up about this. For the Oilers, it's better that Hyman and Bouchard are not going to be playing in this tournament where they could risk injury. It's good they're going to be on the beach somewhere for a week and a half, avoiding hockey and hockey-related objects. You know, you can't get hit by a puck on the beach in Cancun. That's good for the Oilers. You know, I'm not particularly worried. There's an inherent risk anytime you do anything in hockey, even practice, even morning skate. But you can sleep a little bit easier knowing, well, Zach Hyman's been dealing with nagging injuries all season. A week and a half off in the middle of the season, that'd be good for him. Evan Bouchard, I'm sure, like everybody else, he's dealing with nagging pains and discomforts, but he's going to get a week and a half off in the middle of the season to recoup. We're going to take one final break on today's show. We'll do a quick hit on each of the 4 teams in this tournament. We'll get out of here right after this. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out here on this Thursday, Friday, whenever this airs edition of Locked On Oilers. I am very glad to be talking about international hockey because, frankly, international hockey is a gift. It is one of the real great opportunities to grow our sport and put it in front of people who wouldn't traditionally watch it. You know, The weekend, the NHL has this tournament scheduled for. There's no hockey, obviously. There's minimal basketball. Football is over. Baseball isn't on. Soccer is on, but that's different. For the North American sports audience, you are going to get Team USA versus Team Canada on a Saturday night at the Bell Center in Montreal. You know, when we're talking about spectacles and events and moments, USA Canada, best on best for the first time in 9 years, and one of the most famous hockey rinks on the entire planet. It's going to be on ABC down here in the States. I imagine that'll be Sportsnet's Hockey Night in Canada game because there's no NHL game, so I would imagine they have the rights to the national game as well. And you get a moment. And I'll start with USA and Canada. We'll hit Finland and Sweden quickly. But looking at this Canada roster, it's clear the goaltending is the weak link. It is the weakest goaltending group of the 4 teams in this tournament. So with that in mind, the decision makers have decided we want to put together a team that is very well-rounded, that is very, very strong from a defensive perspective to try and minimize the responsibility of our goaltender and frankly of our defense. You know, Aiden Hill has won a Stanley Cup. Jordan Binnington has won a Stanley Cup as backstops on good teams. You know, Binnington didn't have to play out of his mind to help the Blues win the Stanley Cup. It's very similar, actually, to the conversation we have on Locked On Oilers all the time about Stuart Skinner. I don't think Stuart Skinner is an incredible goalie. I don't think he's a world beater by any stretch of the imagination. But if he only has to make a few saves, he's going to be able to do that. He's a talented enough player that if you don't make him be the difference between winning and losing, he can certainly help you win the game. And Hill and Binnington are testaments to that. I don't think Aiden Hill or Jordan Binnington, especially at this stages of their respective careers, are anything remarkable or special. But on a team where they're not going to have to be the best player, they're not going to have to be the difference between winning and losing, there's plenty of opportunity for them to be effective. Now, as for Team USA, I think there's a strong argument this is the best American hockey team ever assembled for an international tournament. I think this is definitely a deeper roster than the 1996 World Cup of Hockey. I think the high-end talent for the first time in my life as a 27, soon-to-be 28-year-old is comparable to what Canada brings to the table. And look, I understand McDavid and McKinnon are better than Matthews and Eichel, but it's not preposterous. You know, the last time we did one of these tournaments, the best American forward was Patrick Kane. And look, Kane, obviously one of the more decorated players of all time, first ballot Hall of Famer, one of the greats of his era. It's different when you're a winger, and it's different when you're not able to be the driver, if you will. You know, every time McDavid gets out on the ice, it's his puck. And Patrick Kane is very good. One of the best players I have ever seen, even in person. McDavid is another tier above that. And I think Matthews, when he's 100%, and look, we know he's not 100%. He missed quite a few weeks from November into December. But when Matthews is locked in, he can hang with those guys. And Eichel, as we Oiler fans can attest, we saw it the other night when the Oilers played Vegas. Eichel played amazing defense on McDavid all night. The Golden Knights hard match. They got Eichel out there against McDavid as frequently as they possibly could and put him in a difficult position and made him really work hard. And if Team USA is able to do that, if they just make McDavid and McKinnon work hard for their offense and their depth gets to be the difference, you know, where Jack Hughes is going to be the best player on the ice at points when we get down to third and fourth lines. And then Team USA, they've got some specialists too. They bring Chris Kreider, the best net front player in the league. You bring Trocheck, the best faceoff man. And Brock Nelson, somebody who's got a ton of playoff experience, who's got a track record of success in the postseason. All of that matters. All of that does matter to some degree. Now, look, I did it for Canada. I'll do it for USA. They should have brought Cole Caulfield and Tage Thompson instead of Kreider and Trocheck. But alas, I'm not in the room. I don't get to make the decision. So it's not the end of the world. I'm not particularly hung up about it. I understand those guys are playing niche roles. They're playing specialist roles. And then for Finland, like most Finnish teams when we get to these tournaments, they are going to play great defense. They are going to be the most sound team. I think their style of play, they're going to play a very heavy cycle game. They're going to really rely on wearing down other teams. They've got a lot of Florida Panthers. They've got a few Hurricanes. They've got a few Stars. All of those teams play this heavy cycle-based game that really annoys teams, that slows them down, and it doesn't allow them to get to transition. If you were to try and draw up how you slow Canada or the United States or Sweden down, you want to do what Finland's going to do. You want to get pucks in deep, force their defensemen to break out, make them go the full 200 feet every time they want to get a scoring chance. And over the course of games, that might be enough. With UC Saros in net, I know he's not off to a great start. The Predators are really struggling as a team. With all of that in mind, there's a recipe here for them. And then real quick on Sweden, great high-end talent. Nylander, Jesper Bratt, remarkable players. You have Dahlin and Carlson on the back end. There's so much talent. Forgot to mention Philip Forsberg, who, like Saros, is on a pretty poor team. So I don't blame you if you haven't watched a ton of the Predators this year, but there is an abundance of talent. And I've been saying this for like 3 years now. There's a strong argument we're living in the golden age of the NHL right now as far as players. We have never had this many gifted players all at the same time. We have the intersection of generations where we've got Crosby all the way down to guys like Brock Faber, who are barely out of college, who barely can grow facial hair. The game, the quality of player, the average quality of player is so much higher than it was 10 years ago. Think about where we were 10 years ago, where Jamie Benn was winning awards with 87 points. It was a big deal when guys started breaking 100 points again. Now, the question is anybody going to hit 150, 160? Can someone get to 170 again for the first time since the 90s? That's really the question. We are in a really interesting period in the NHL's growth because it is trying to make up for self-inflicted mistakes, 2 lockouts, not handling pandemic growth in terms of their revenues the best possible way. But the NHL made it to the other side. There's an element of cockroach resilience here where, in spite of the fallout, the NHL is still here. And I'm very grateful we're going to have this tournament in person next year. I'm very grateful that we're going to get to see McDavid play with McKinnon and Crosby for the first time. And I'm going to do some deliberating. I might end up ponying up to $300-$400 to go see Canada play the United States at the Bell Center on that Saturday. But that'll just about do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. I want to thank everyone who made the show their first listen of the day. If you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you listen on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell. And thank you for making the show your first listen of the day. Now, go check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast, where you can get all the tips you need to win your league from steal and flip. It is available wherever you get your podcasts. I'll talk to you guys after the game against the Blue Jackets.